He fell asleep during a simple hypnosis session meant to cure his headaches, and when he woke up 20 minutes later he had spoken in a voice that was not his own about a civilization that sank beneath the ocean 12,000 years ago. He had described crystal technology and energy systems that modern science was only beginning to understand. He had given his name in that lost world, his work, his death, and he had no memory of saying any of it. But the recording was there, playing back words about Atlantis that he consciously knew nothing about. His name was Thomas, and the headaches had been plaguing him for months. Doctors found nothing wrong. CT scans came back clear. Pain medication barely touched them. They were intense, debilitating migraines that would strike without warning and leave him unable to function for hours. A friend had suggested hypnotherapy as a last resort, saying it had helped her with chronic pain. Thomas was skeptical but desperate, so he made an appointment with a hypnotherapist named Dr. Sandra, who came highly recommended. The session started normally enough. Dr. Sandra had a soothing voice and a calm presence that put Thomas at ease. She explained that they would use hypnosis to help his subconscious mind address whatever was causing the headaches, whether it was stress or tension or some emotional block he wasn't consciously aware of. Thomas agreed, settled into a comfortable recliner, and closed his eyes as Dr. Sandra began the induction. She guided him to relax, to focus on his breathing, to let his body grow heavy and still. Thomas felt himself drifting, slipping into that space between waking and sleeping where thoughts became liquid and time lost its meaning. Dr. Sandra's voice was distant but clear, suggesting that his subconscious mind would reveal the source of his headaches, would show him what needed to be understood or healed. And then Thomas was gone. Not physically, but consciously. He slipped into such a deep state of trance that his normal waking awareness completely disappeared. What happened next, he would only know about from the recording Dr. Sandra made of every session. On the recording, about 5 minutes into the session, Thomas's voice changed. It became deeper, more formal, with a strange accent that didn't match any modern language pattern. And he began to speak about things Thomas had never studied, never thought about, never even heard of in his conscious life. He said his name in that other time was Atlanra, and he was a crystal technician in the great civilization of Atlantis. He described the city where he lived, a place of impossible beauty and advanced technology, with buildings that seemed to defy gravity and systems powered by massive crystals that drew energy directly from the earth and the sun. He spoke about his work maintaining these crystal energy systems, ensuring they stayed balanced and aligned, preventing them from becoming unstable or dangerous. He described Atlantean society in detail. The council of elders who governed with wisdom and spiritual understanding, the temples where people went not just for religious worship but for healing and education and raising their consciousness, the gardens that grew food year-round, using techniques that worked with nature rather than against it, the transportation systems that moved people and goods without pollution or noise. It was a civilization far more advanced than anything that existed in Thomas's modern world, and yet he spoke about it with the casual familiarity of someone describing their hometown. But then his voice grew troubled. He described how the civilization had begun to decline, how some Atlanteans had started using the crystal technology for purposes it wasn't designed for, how greed and the desire for power had corrupted what was meant to be a tool for healing and harmony, how the crystals, when misused, became weapons of terrible destruction, how warnings from the elders were ignored by those who thought they could control forces they didn't fully understand. Atlanra spoke about the final days, the earthquakes that grew more frequent and more violent, the ocean acting strangely, receding and then returning with massive waves, the crystals becoming unstable, their energy fluctuating wildly, the growing sense of doom that hung over the city as people began to realize that the end was coming. He described trying desperately to shut down the crystal systems, to prevent a catastrophic energy release, but being unable to stop what had already been set in motion by years of misuse and imbalance. And then he described the day Atlantis fell, the massive earthquake that split the land, the tsunamis that crashed over the coastal cities, the crystal energy centers exploding with such force that entire sections of the continent shattered and sank beneath the waves. He described being in one of the main temple complexes when it happened, feeling the ground drop away beneath him, being pulled under by the rushing water, drowning as the civilization he loved disappeared into the ocean. But even more significant than the death itself was what Atlanra said about the trauma of that ending. He spoke about the guilt he carried, the feeling that he should have done more to prevent the catastrophe, that he should have spoken louder against the misuse of the crystals, that he should have found a way to stop what was happening. He spoke about the grief of watching everything he knew and loved being destroyed in a matter of hours, and he spoke about a vow he made in those final moments, a promise that if he ever lived again, he would remember this lesson, would use whatever knowledge he carried to prevent similar destruction from happening to other civilizations. The recording showed that Thomas spoke in this altered state for nearly 15 minutes, providing information about Atlantis that was remarkably consistent and detailed. Then his voice faded. He went silent for a few moments, and Dr. Sandra gently brought him back to normal consciousness. Thomas opened his eyes, feeling refreshed and calm, his headache completely gone. He looked at Dr. Sandra and asked how long he had been under. She told him about 20 minutes. He said that was good, he felt much better, and asked if anything interesting had happened during the session. Dr. Sandra looked at him carefully and asked what he remembered. Nothing, he said. He had just drifted off and then woke up feeling better. That's when Dr. Sandra played him the recording. Thomas listened in absolute shock as his own voice, but not his own voice, spoke about Atlantis and crystal technology and the fall of an ancient civilization. He had no memory of saying any of it. No memory of being at Lanra or experiencing any of those events. It was like listening to a stranger speak, except the stranger was using his vocal cords. His first reaction was to think it must be some kind of unconscious fantasy, his imagination creating a story while he was in trance. But Dr. Sandra pointed out the level of detail, the consistency of the narrative, the technical descriptions of crystal technology that included concepts Thomas had no conscious knowledge of. She suggested that what they had witnessed was spontaneous past life recall, that Thomas had somehow accessed memories from a previous incarnation in Atlantis. Thomas didn't know what to think. He didn't particularly believe in Atlantis. He thought it was probably just a myth, a story Plato had made up or embellished, and he definitely didn't believe in past lives or reincarnation. But he couldn't deny what was on the recording. That was his voice, speaking about things he didn't know. And strangest of all, the headache that had been torturing him for months was completely gone and never came back. Dr. Sandra suggested they do another session, this time specifically exploring the Atlantis connection. If this past life was breaking through so strongly that it was causing physical symptoms, it might be important to understand it more fully. Thomas was hesitant, but also deeply curious. He agreed to return the following week for a focused past life regression session. In the days between sessions, Thomas couldn't stop thinking about what he had heard on the recording. He started researching Atlantis online, reading about Plato's descriptions and various theories about where it might have been located. He was surprised to discover that some researchers took it seriously, that there were geological theories about landmasses that might have existed in the Atlantic Ocean or Mediterranean Sea and then sank due to earthquakes or sea level changes. He also found information about crystal technology, about how crystals could store and transmit energy, about piezoelectric properties and other phenomena that modern science was only beginning to understand and utilize. Some of what Atlanra had described didn't sound as impossible as Thomas initially thought. Advanced ancient civilizations weren't as crazy an idea as he had assumed. The second session arrived. This time, Dr. Sandra used a technique specifically designed for past life regression. She guided Thomas into trance again. But instead of just letting his subconscious speak freely, she asked specific questions, directed his attention to the Atlantean lifetime, helped him access the memories more consciously so he could observe and report what he was experiencing. This time, Thomas didn't lose consciousness completely. He remained aware of himself lying in the chair in Dr. Sandra's office, but simultaneously he was experiencing himself as Atlanra in ancient Atlantis. It was like living in two timelines at once, his awareness split between present and past. He saw Atlantis not as a fantasy but as a memory. The city rose up around him in vivid detail. Massive structures made of white stone that seemed to glow with an inner light. Towers reaching toward the sky, topped with enormous crystals that rotated slowly, catching the sunlight and distributing energy throughout the city. Gardens and waterways woven through the architecture. People moving through the streets wearing flowing robes and jewel tones, their bearing confident and purposeful. Dr. Sandra asked him to describe a typical day as Atlanra. He found himself in his workshop, a space filled with crystals of various sizes and colors. His job was to tune them, to ensure they were vibrating at the correct frequencies, to safely channel and distribute energy. It was delicate work that required both technical knowledge and intuitive sensitivity. The crystals weren't just inert objects, they were alive in their own way, conscious, and had to be approached with respect and understanding. He described the training he had received, years of study under master technicians who had learned from their masters before them. The knowledge had been passed down through generations, carefully guarded, only taught to those who demonstrated both the aptitude and the character to use it responsibly, because the power contained in the crystals was immense. Misused, it could cause tremendous harm. Dr. Sandra asked him to move to a significant moment in that lifetime. The scene shifted, and Atlanra found himself in a council meeting. The elders were discussing reports of unauthorized crystal experiments being conducted by a faction that wanted to use the technology for military purposes. They wanted to create weapons to ensure Atlantis' dominance over other lands. The elders were opposed, explaining that the crystals were never meant for such purposes, that attempting to weaponize them would destabilize the entire energy grid. But the military faction argued that the world was becoming more dangerous, that other civilizations were developing their own technologies, that Atlantis needed to stay ahead to remain secure. They portrayed the elders as naive and out of touch, and gradually, despite the warnings, they gained influence. They built their own crystal facilities in secret locations, experimenting with configurations that pushed the crystals beyond their safe parameters. Atlanra spoke up in these council meetings, supported the elders, argued passionately against the military applications. But he wasn't loud enough, wasn't influential enough. His warnings were noted and then ignored by those who had already decided what they wanted to do, and he watched helplessly as the civilization he loved began to tear itself apart from within, divided between those who respected the sacred nature of the technology and those who saw only power to be exploited. Dr. Sandra asked him to move to the end of that lifetime. Atlanra found himself in the main temple complex on what would be the last day of Atlantis. The earthquakes had been growing stronger all week. People were frightened. Many were trying to leave the city. But Atlanra and other technicians were working frantically to stabilize the crystal energy systems, hoping they could prevent a complete catastrophe. He was in the central crystal chamber, a massive space carved deep into the bedrock beneath the temple. The primary crystal was enormous, easily 50 feet tall, suspended in the center of the chamber, surrounded by smaller crystals arranged in precise geometric patterns. Under normal circumstances, the crystal hummed with a stable, harmonious frequency, but now it was screaming, its energy fluctuating wildly, responding to the unstable geological conditions and the damage done by years of misuse. Atlanra and his fellow technicians tried everything they knew to bring it back into balance. They adjusted the surrounding crystals, changed the configurations, used toning and sound to try to harmonize the frequencies. But nothing worked. The damage was too severe. The imbalance had gone too far. And then came the massive earthquake, the one that would end everything. The ground shook so violently that Atlanra was thrown to the floor. The walls of the chamber cracked. The primary crystal's energy spiked to levels that should have been impossible, glowing so bright it hurt to look at. And then it exploded, releasing all its stored energy in a single catastrophic pulse that rippled outward, shattering the bedrock, triggering even larger earthquakes and tsunamis. Atlanra felt the floor drop away beneath him as the entire temple complex collapsed and sank. Water rushed in, cold and violent. He was pulled under, tumbling in the chaos, unable to breathe, unable to swim against the force of the water. His last thoughts as Atlanra were of profound sadness and regret. Sadness for his civilization dying, regret that he hadn't done more to prevent it, and a final desperate hope that somehow, someone would learn from this, would remember the lessons of Atlantis and not repeat the same mistakes. Thomas experienced Atlanra's death, felt the drowning, felt the separation of consciousness from body, and then he found himself in a space between lives, a place of light and peace where Atlanra's soul went to rest and review after that traumatic lifetime. Dr. Sandra asked if there were guides or teachers present. Thomas saw them, felt them, beings of profound wisdom who helped Atlanra understand what had happened and why. They explained that the fall of Atlantis had been a lesson for humanity, a demonstration of what happens when advanced technology is developed without corresponding spiritual and ethical growth. When people have the power to reshape reality but not the wisdom to use that power responsibly, destruction becomes inevitable. The guides showed Atlanra that his own guilt was misplaced. He had done what he could. He had spoken up, had tried to prevent the catastrophe. But some lessons can only be learned through experience, even painful experience. The fall of Atlantis was such a lesson, and the trauma of it would be carried forward by many souls who lived through it, encoded in humanity's collective memory as a warning about the dangers of technology without conscience. The guides also showed Atlanra something important about his future incarnations. He would return to Earth multiple times, always drawn to work involving energy, technology, and healing. He would carry forward the technical knowledge he had gained in Atlantis, but would also carry the awareness of how that knowledge could be misused. This dual awareness would make him cautious, sometimes overly so, but it would also make him a responsible guardian of whatever knowledge he possessed. And then the guides showed him the incarnation, as Thomas Bay explained, that he had chosen to incarnate in the 21st century. A time when humanity was once again developing powerful technologies that could either elevate or destroy civilization. Thomas's soul carried the memory of Atlantis as both a gift and a warning. His unconscious knowledge of crystal technology and energy systems could contribute to modern understanding if he chose to explore and share it. But he would also carry the caution born from watching a civilization destroy itself through misuse of similar technology. The guides explained that the headaches Thomas had been experiencing were caused by this Atlantean memory trying to surface the trauma of the crystal explosion. The intensity of that final day was still lodged in his energy body, creating tension that manifested as physical pain. Now that the memory had been accessed and understood, the headaches would cease. The energy was released, the trauma acknowledged, the lesson integrated. Dr. Sandra brought Thomas back to present consciousness slowly and gently. When he opened his eyes this time, he was crying. The experience had been so real, so vivid, so emotionally powerful, that he couldn't dismiss it as fantasy. He had been Atlanra, he had lived in Atlantis, he had experienced its fall, and that memory, buried for thousands of years, had shaped his current life in ways he was only beginning to understand. They talked for a long time after the session. Thomas asked Dr. Sandra if she believed Atlantis was real. She said she didn't know for certain, that there was no definitive archaeological proof, but that many people who underwent past life regression described similar Atlantean memories with remarkable consistency. The details varied, but the core elements were the same: an advanced civilization, crystal technology, misuse of power, catastrophic destruction. She explained that whether Atlantis was a literal historical place or a symbolic representation of humanity as repeated pattern of rising and falling didn't really matter. What mattered was the lesson, the understanding, the healing that came from accessing the memory. Thomas had been carrying trauma from that lifetime, whether it happened on Earth 12,000 years ago or in some other dimension or timeline. And now that trauma was released. In the weeks and months that followed, Thomas's life changed in unexpected ways. The headaches never returned, which was remarkable enough. But more significantly, he found himself drawn to study topics he had never been interested in before: crystal properties and piezoelectricity, sacred geometry, alternative energy systems. He took online courses, read extensively, connected with others who were working in these fields. He also noticed that he seemed to have intuitive understanding of these subjects that went beyond what he was learning consciously. He would encounter complex concepts and immediately grasp them, as if remembering something he had once known rather than learning something new. Occasionally he would have flashes of insight about how certain energy systems could be improved or how crystals could be used in healing applications. The knowledge was there, buried in his subconscious, slowly becoming accessible. Thomas started working with crystals himself, not in any commercial way but as personal exploration. He discovered he had a sensitivity to their energies, could feel their vibrations, could intuitively sense which crystals would work well for specific purposes. Friends and family started asking him about crystals, about which ones they should use for various needs, and Thomas found he could guide them accurately, drawing on knowledge that came from somewhere deeper than books or courses. He also became passionate about the ethical use of technology. He volunteered with organizations working on sustainable energy, on technologies that worked in harmony with nature rather than exploiting it. He wrote articles and gave talks about the need to develop spiritual and ethical wisdom alongside technical capability. His Atlantean memory had made him acutely aware of the dangers of powerful technology in the hands of people who weren't ready for it. Thomas thought often about Atlanra. about that past life version of himself who had tried to prevent a catastrophe and failed. He felt compassion for Etlinra, understanding now that the guilt he had carried was unnecessary. Etlinra had done his best. The fall of Atlantis hadn't been his fault personally. It had been the result of collective choices, of a society that lost its way, of the inevitable consequences of misusing sacred knowledge. But Thomas also felt grateful to Etlinra that lifetime had given him knowledge and awareness that was valuable in his current incarnation. The memory of Atlantis made him more conscious, more careful, more committed to using his understanding responsibly. He wasn't just Thomas, an ordinary guy living an ordinary life. He was a soul who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, who carried ancient wisdom, who had incarnated specifically to help humanity navigate the dangers of our current technological age. He did more regression sessions with Dr. Sandra, exploring other lifetimes, understanding the full scope of his soul's journey. But the Atlantean life remained the most significant, the one that had the most direct impact on his current incarnation. It was his defining lifetime, the one that had shaped him most profoundly. Years later, Thomas would look back on that first hypnosis session as the turning point of his life. He had gone in hoping to cure a headache and had ended up discovering an entire dimension of his existence he had unknown was there. He had remembered Atlantis, not from books or movies but from actual lived experience. And that memory had transformed him, had given him purpose and direction, had connected him to something vast and ancient and ongoing. He wondered sometimes about the other souls who had lived in Atlantis, who had experienced its fall. Where were they now? Had they remembered? Were they also working to prevent humanity from repeating the same mistakes? He felt a kinship with people he met who shared similar concerns, similar passions, similar awareness of the dangers facing modern civilization. Perhaps they were his old soul family from Atlantis, gathered again in this lifetime to try once more to help humanity choose wisdom over power. And he carried the memory forward, shared it with those who were ready to hear it, used it as a teaching tool about the importance of consciousness and ethics in technological development. He didn't claim to prove that Atlantis was real or that everyone should believe in past lives. He simply shared his experience, offered his perspective, and trusted that those who needed to hear it would understand. Because that was the real lesson from Atlantis, wasn't it? Not just the specific details about crystals and energy systems, but the broader understanding that humanity had been here before, had reached great heights before, had fallen before, and would keep rising and falling until enough people remembered, until enough souls carried forward the wisdom gained from previous cycles, until humanity finally learned to balance power with conscience, technology with spirituality, advancement with compassion. Thomas knew he was part of that ongoing work. His memory of Atlantis wasn't just about his personal past. It was part of humanity's collective memory, part of the species-level learning that happened across millennia. And by remembering, by sharing, by working to apply those ancient lessons to modern challenges, he was helping to write the next chapter of humanity's story, a chapter that might, if enough people awakened and remembered, finally break the cycle and lead to a civilization that did not destroy itself but learned to live sustainably, harmoniously, consciously, on this beautiful planet. Watch the next video to explore more memories from civilizations lost to time.